Jackie?
Yeah, thank you, Kamla, for that introduction, and to the CCGI for inviting me to speak on the topic of boards of directors and how to obtain optimal results. This is a topic that is very dear to my heart. My career and involvement with boards spans some 30 years, as Kamla mentioned, and involves the role of chairman, that of a director in a private company, public listed companies, and in state enterprises. I've also been senior management. So all told, I've had the experience of acting in each one of these positions and to see, pick up things that work and things that don't work, and see how one really can achieve the optimal synergistic relationship between all the parties so that ultimately the organization and its stakeholders benefit. So what I intend to do today is look at each of these roles in turn: the role of director, the role of management, and the role of the chairman. At the best, your board is a collective body that is comprised persons of varying experiences, and it's pulling all these experiences together that gives you or gives the organization the benefit of their experience. I'm not going to focus today on the legal role and responsibilities on, say, the Companies Act or the corporate governance codes or the corporate law books, because I think that's something one can do oneself if one is interested. But what I'm trying to do here is make it a little more real and talk about issues that have arise in the boardroom that one has to encounter. So it'd be particularly useful for people who maybe are new to the role of management and interacting with their board for the first time, or have been approached to act as a director on a board, or maybe as a chairman and settling into that role. So I'm going to touch on some of the issues that people won't usually speak about, but that will ultimately affect the optimal operation of your board. That said, we're going to start sort of with the culture of the organization. The culture of your board and how it operates is going to be set by and large by your chairman and the CEO. They will set the tone for the way in which meetings are conducted. Often you find that meetings are conducted by consensus. Most of the boards I have been on, decisions are taken by consensus without the very formal ritual of proposing and seconding resolutions. So there's a sort of more informal flow of information, but that really is up to the type of company you are in and the relationship that the CEO and the chairman have and the tone they want to set for meetings. So without more, we're going to launch into the presentation. I think I have some slides there somewhere. All right, and we can go to the first real slide. Can we, yes, this one. All right, well, we're going to just start. Can you go back a bit to the picture of the board? This is what boards used to look like in the good old days. That's no longer so. I mean, we really, and I'm going to stress throughout the presentation how important diversity is. And I think in the Caribbean, we've done a tremendous job. We've come a very long way. Boards no longer look like this, but we still have a ways to go. So I'm always going to have a plug for more women on boards. Diversity, and not beyond women as well. We all live in such we have a rich culture, a rich experience. We want to bring that to the organization in which the board is sitting and to its customers. So you can have all the technical skills in the board around the boardroom table, but if you don't have the influence of the culture and the diversity of your society reflected there as well, you're going to be losing out on a vital contribution and input to what is your decision making. All right, so we can do away with this board and change the slide. This is not where we are. We've moved on from there. So you're honored as a new director to have been chosen to serve on a board. Justifiably so, because it means that the nomination committee or the shareholder has looked at your experience and think that you have a contribution, you have an expertise or a contribution that their organization or company can benefit from. So you feel justifiably chuffed by it. But you have to realize this is not about your ego. They're really calling on you to serve and to give of yourself. It's about the company and the stakeholders. So we're going to look at some of the issues and some of the ways in which I think a director new to a board should behave. The first of all, it's a very time-consuming business. You have to prepare for the meeting and you have to read your board papers. And this may seem obvious to some of you, but I've been on many boards, been involved in many boards where you can tell the directors just haven't bothered to read the papers. It's not necessarily always their fault. Sometimes you can, especially in the old days before we had electronic papers, and you could get a stack of board papers, sort of 3 inches thick, a few days before the meeting that you were supposed to go through. But no matter once you have agreed to go on the board, you have to put aside the time to go through the board papers, focus on what the decision is you're being asked to make, and really analyze it so you can come up with good questions and challenge your management. But before you do that, you really have to become a little familiar with the business that you're going to, the business of the company on which you're going to serve. So you also need to take the time to read some of the annual reports, find out something about the market in which it's operating, the economy, and the context in which your decisions have to be made. A lot of this will be done in your induction onto the board, but you need to take it a step further yourself and show an interest and read around the company so that you can really give the company the benefit of your expertise. I think often people are a little nervous about asking questions. They feel that their questions might be stupid or they're going to show that they didn't understand. You have to remember that as a director on the board, you are responsible for the decision making, the decisions that are made. There is no such thing as a stupid question. And you will often find that when you ask the question, it's going to trigger a response from your other directors, and you'll end up having a very rich discussion. So don't be cowed by the feeling that you're going to show that you really don't know. Ask the question and allow the discussion to flow from there. So ask your questions. Then I was talking about most boards operate by consensus. However, if you do feel very strongly about a matter, insist that it be noted and noted in the minutes. You are entitled to feel have different opinions from your directors. Nobody wants groupthink, because again, that is not beneficial to anyone around the table. So state your position, show that you disagree, but if it is that you feel very strongly and it is material to what is being discussed, you can ask for it to be noted in the minutes. And we'll know from our company's law that if you don't want to be taken to have agreed to the decision, it must be noted in the minutes. Along the lines of asking questions as well, feel free to always call upon your corporate secretary, the chairman, or the CEO with questions on the business. There's only a finite time for a board meeting, and I think 3 hours is probably just about the right kind of length of time, and that's pushing it, but less than that is probably better. So when you're going through your board papers, you may pick up issues that you don't understand or need clarification on. There is absolutely nothing wrong with calling one of the people that I have mentioned, your chairman, your CEO, or the corporate secretary, and asking them for assistance in understanding the paper. And this will allow the meeting to flow a little faster. You will have clarified some of the issues and really be able to participate in the discussion when it takes place. Can we change the slide? Hello? Yeah. Now that said, you have to respect the opinion of your CEO and management. Don't undermine their authority. Now, some people feel because they've been appointed to the board, they're now, I suppose, in charge, in authority, and that they can now walk around the company as if they own the company and ask questions of managers, and maybe if you're at a bank, walk into a branch and challenge a manager, that sort of thing. No, that sort of behavior is not permissible. You have to respect your chairman, your CEO, and management, and not undermine their authority. When you're appointed, it's not a question of catching the management. You're supporting them. And there is a way in which things are done. So if you want to find out more about the company or ask a question on how it operates or find out something about it, use the channels, the established channels, to get the information. Go to your corporate secretary, call your CEO, or call the chairman. And that is so much easier nowadays, or you can just, in most cases, you have a WhatsApp group, you can ask the question very quickly or send an email without sort of disturbing the flow, get the information. And all of this allows for your board meetings to move and flow smoothly. Don't, and in that trend, I'm asking that you don't obsess about the unimportant. There are certain things, a board meeting should have a focus, and each item or issue on your agenda should have a resolution so you know what you're being asked to decide. Don't obsess about the things that are not critical. You can let those pass unless you feel extraordinarily strongly about it. But if it's not the decision you're being asked to make, let it go. Have you ever been to a board meeting where 50% of the meeting is spent correcting the minutes and the other 50% is spent on matters arising? Something is wrong with that. You can't have a meeting, you can't have a progressive meeting and make decisions in an environment like that. Something is wrong. So although lively discussion is to be encouraged, and a director does not have to speak on every issue, and verbatim minutes are not, in my view, useful. Wastes a lot of time. What you really need is a smart corporate secretary who can give a concise summary of what is being taken, and together with the resolution, you have a summary of the discussion and your resolution. Many people feel that having your name mentioned in the minutes is synonymous with your contribution. That is not in fact so. So really, I'm not in favor of verbatim minutes at all. I don't think they're useful. And it means that your meeting is going to be spent reviewing the minutes and then doing your matters arising. And you're not going to have any time for the actual business of the meeting and moving the company forward. I did have I remember an encounter with one director who told me that when the minutes of his company, the company in which he sat, was so verbose that what he used to do when he got them is do a word check and go through the minutes and see how many times his name appeared. And he would only read the minutes where his name appeared to make sure he wasn't misquoted in any respect. Now, and that's not useful, and those minutes can't be very meaningful at the end of the day. So really, you want your decision and a little context in what the discussion was that the directors might have had, how long it took, if it was controversial or not, and then your decision. It's all a question of respect. As a new director, you have to respect your CEO and your management and your chairman, and ask if you have issues or the things that concern you. Also, be very alert to your conflicts of interest. If you feel that they might have a conflict of interest, it's always better to bring it up early, have it discussed, decide whether it is in fact a conflict of interest, and put it to rest. But don't allow it to be discovered by accident in the meeting.
Is Jacqueline's screen frozen? Yes, it seems so.
Yes, she's frozen.
Okay. All right, because Joanne, I think it's time for the next slide now. So you could probably move it, and then let's see if by then she is back with us. All right. So we'll just give her a minute. I think this whole issue of the numbers of people who are online at the same time, our companies have not all been as ready to provide the support and bandwidth. So hopefully they will get all of that sorted out more soon. Hopefully Jacqueline will be rejoining us very shortly. Because the usual thing is when you are caught up in the midst of something, it's difficult for you to be able to separate yourself and be able to identify the issues around it. And, you know, in our region, really, we have so many conflicts that sometimes develop and we just, you know, don't recognize it. So I thought that was a really nice point that she made. And as we wait for her to join us as well, I really appreciate the guidance with respect to the time spent in the board meeting being progressive and strategic rather than focusing just on the minutes of the meeting and correcting the minutes, you know. There are two major functions we talk about for the board of directors, and that would be both performance and conformance. So conformance meaning that you want to ensure that your organization is in line with rules and regulations that applies to it. But a more powerful component is really the performance aspect. How do directors bring those skills and qualities for which they are chosen to be on a board to help in providing that guidance to management so that they can benefit from those skills? So the performance aspect of the role of board of directors also requires that in the boardroom, there is time spent in strategizing, in looking at opportunities for the business to grow. Okay, and I see there is a question from Karen in the chat, and I think it is a good question. So as we wait, we give Jacqueline a few more minutes. Karen's question is there a best practice or preferred template when it comes to recording minutes? So I'm not sure if anyone wants to take that question because I think it really is an area that we are evolving. You know, so many different organizations have different practices. So would anyone like to volunteer? Sure, Brendan? Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Hi. I had the same issue on a board in a subsidiary of the bank. I won't say which one. It was in an area that reported to me. I didn't go to this board every meeting, but I would go periodically when my schedule allowed. Hadn't been to a board meeting in a while. I went down. The first 45 minutes of that board meeting was about typos and various little issues within the minutes, you know, so I found it quite unproductive and made a change thereafter. After that, we have a great corporate secretary in Trinidad and does a tremendous job, Rachel Lakis. And I elevated her role to perform that services for all our boards in the Caribbean. And maybe it was a bit more of an art than a science, but as Jacqueline said, you know, the ability to distill conversations to their key points so that only the key points are highlighted and focused on, and the board minutes are, you know, compact and concise. That's she became very good at that and trained our other corporate secretaries to do the same. So I'm not sure if there's a template, but it's about, you know, getting to the heart of the matter and making sure the minutes are brief and concise, fairly point out, you know, put the point forward, but without quoting everybody ad nauseum. So that would be my view.
Kamala, if I could add, I think that that there is quite a bit of guidance out there, depending on the program that you're in. You know, the corporate governance training nowadays does address that quite a lot. But I think that what I would like to add, and I wholeheartedly endorse what's been said so far, is that there are really two legal reasons why you want the minutes to be as Jackie and Brendan have suggested. First of all, the purpose of the minutes, of course, is to record the decisions and the rationale for the decision, but they also are intended to show that the directors have discharged their duty in terms of the due diligence that would have been involved in reaching a decision and making an informed decision. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I think that you also want to make sure is that the decision and the minute and the rationale is captured in a succinct way, full but succinct. Because one of the things that I was going to note in my presentation is that I think it's highly advisable for corporate secretaries to destroy the notes or the recording after the minutes have been confirmed, and there's no question of any likely change. And the reason for that is because they could become discoverable in a court matter, and you don't want to have, you know, a lot of extraneous discussion which could get fed into the records. So you want to make sure that those minutes are not overly verbose, but can stand on their own. And as I said, this demonstrate that the directors have done their job in terms of making an informed decision in the best interest of the company.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So Jacqueline, welcome back.
Oh, dear me. Well, that's the vagaries of technology. My apologies.
Absolutely, nothing to apologize for. It's not something that you would have had control over. But just before we invite you to restart, I just want to ask if there was a suggestion whether all of us having on our videos would have affected that. Now, I'm thinking not, because I think each individual's bandwidth is set, and therefore together it will not impact your ability to deliver.
No, I don't think it's going to impact it. I think it was internal. Okay. Sometimes our internet connection is a little vague.
All right. Okay. So then I would encourage persons to put back on their videos if they can.
And it's nice to see faces.
Yes, it is. It is. It helps really with feeling more engaged. So you had ended off where you were speaking about declaring conflicts of interest. So I wasn't sure if you finished with that point and you wanted to move to the slide, or you'd like us to go back to it.
I think we can go on to management now. So we could go to the next slide where we can start with management. So in fact, it went off at a good point.
Yes.
All right. Relax myself, yes. Right. Management, we've all been there at some stage. And as management, I've interacted with the board of directors fairly often. Management can spend a long weeks, months, days working on a particular issue and preparing a board paper, and you take it to board and it gets torn to shreds. But at the same time, management has to understand that the directors and their opinion count. Ultimately, the directors are the ones that are responsible to the company, and they are the ones going to be held accountable at the end of the day. So you have to respect the directors and their opinions. But I must tell you, as management, I have been there. I've worked on the board paper. It might have been a paper with a legal issue in it, and you've prepared it and think you've done an absolutely brilliant job, and you walk into the boardroom and it's torn to shreds. Now, one of my experiences and one of my lessons, and I think as management, and if you have any sort of sense, you only need to learn a lesson once. I was on a board where, no, I wasn't on the board, I was management, and one of the directors of the board would have been Russell Martineau, senior counsel. And one of the papers that I was responsible for bringing to the board had legal issues in it. And I brought paper, did my presentation, and then I had Russell Martineau, senior counsel, to deal with, and he tore my paper to shreds. Well, you only need to learn that lesson once. After that, about 2-3 days before the board meeting, if I knew there was any legal issue in it, I would pick up my papers and trot off down the road, make an appointment, go and see Mr. Martineau and have him discuss the paper with him. So he could raise any issues he might have had with me then. I could clarify them. I could explain exactly what it is we were trying to do and get his guidance. And when I get back and the board paper is presented at the board meeting, I know he has my back. And he says so. He says he has no problem with the paper because X, Y, and Z, and you feel comfortable. That is a strategy I recommend for most people, where you have the technical expertise around the table, the boardroom table, and you have directors that you know have a particular expertise. They're going to zero in on the board paper where they can show off their expertise. The best thing to do is to make sure they have sight of that board paper and they understand the issues before it is presented. It saves a tremendous amount of time. It saves a lot of heartache. And at the end of the day, the board gets the benefit of the director's experience at that time. So as we say in the slide there, directors are not the experts. Management is. Management has to be patient, and management in doing presenting their paper should break it down so that all the directors are able to understand. Now, in your board of directors, you're going to have different people around the table with different skill sets. Their skill might be IR, might be legal, might be finance, and everybody is expected to contribute to all the papers. You have to break down your paper. I was going to say to the lowest common denominator, but that sounds a little not quite right. But you must break your paper down, no matter what the technical area is, into language that every director can understand, and so they can contribute, because they are responsible at the end of the day for the decision that is going to be made. I'm a very firm believer in presentations. I don't think any board paper should really be more than 2 pages long, 2 foolscap pages. But what management should do is be able to zero in on the issues that the board has to consider and what the resolution is that has to be decided. So when you do a presentation, you can break it down into 5 slides. You have the issues so that when the board see it, they know that I have to consider X, I have to consider 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this is the resolution I'm expected to give at the end of the day. Makes it much easier to give the directors focus, and you're more likely to come out with the decision you expect at the end of the day. It also helps those directors that have not had a chance to read their papers thoroughly get up to speed because you've given them a focus. Moving on a bit there to the point 3 there. On the other hand, you have to give your directors something to focus on. This is Trinidad and Tobago, and I know it's the same in Barbados and the rest of the Caribbean. When the public hear that you're on a board, they're going to approach you with questions. They're going to want to know why the ABM machine at Lime Grove doesn't have cash on a Friday evening, or why that particular soap doesn't come in a bucket anymore and you can only get it in paper sachets, or any multitude of questions to deal with the company on which you're serving. And they're going to expect you to answer. Now, we know there's a distinction between what is management business and what is director's business. And directors are not supposed to micromanage and get into the day-to-day business. But they're going to get these questions. So really, what a company should do is facilitate this, set up a system for dealing with directors and the questions they get so they can save face. I mean, everybody will get it. They expect you to be able to have your finger on the pulse of the company and be able to deal with all the issues. So Maybe it's a corporate secretary. You can text the corporate secretary and she can arrange for somebody to call the individual and speak to them or explain it, or maybe give you a brief solution that you can give, and you can satisfy the public's aim. But you need to allow the director to save face a little bit. We have the next slide. And we're going back now to writing of a board paper. This is a skill. You need to give the director everything he needs she needs to make the decision at the time. So you need to refer a bit to the history of the matter, where it came from, why this decision is necessary, were prior decisions made, summarize it all, and then the thing that is the most important, the resolution. Some people even put the resolution at the beginning, at the opening of the paper, so that when you pick up the paper, you know exactly, you have the focus, you know exactly what it is you're required to decide. Management should also be certain of the outcome of the paper. You don't take a paper to board hoping that the board is going to pass it. You must have a fairly clear idea of who your directors are, what their focus is going to be, and whether your paper is going to go through. If you're in doubt, don't take it. Work some more on it, maybe lobby your directors, explain it to them, but there's no point taking a paper to board if it's not going to pass. It makes management look bad, and it just wastes the time of the board. You can, and I always stress that you must go with the resolution to focus to focus the mind of the board exactly on what they're supposed to decide. If you feel there is an alternative resolution, you can take that as well, just to have it in your back pocket. But you must focus, have the resolution and focus the intention of the board on that particular decision. And then now, just as a question of courtesy now, keep your board informed on matters in the public domain. Don't allow them to read it in the papers for the first time. If there's a press release, or if there's some disaster or some reputational issue, shoot them off an email, let them know what is happening, and so they don't read about it in the media. Again, their friends, their family, and their neighbors are going to expect them to know what is happening. So help them to save face a little bit and keep up to speed with what is happening. Don't let them read about it in the media. And then at the beginning of the meeting as well, we spoke very briefly on the issue of Zoom and cameras on. I'm a firm believer on cameras on. Once the meeting is being conducted, it should be conducted in as close as environment as to the actual boardroom. You want to see management's faces. You want to see if possible, of your fellow directors, and see what the reaction is. You want to be able to see that they're paying attention and then they're not on their phone or taking phone calls or doing other things. I find looking at a blank space is very disconcerting. So my view is, and I know some companies have very formal policies on it, meeting, Zoom, cameras on, so we can see who is there and who is paying attention. Okay, so moving on. The chairman. And on again, the seesaw, balancing act. He is the one who pulls it all together. If there's an orchestra, he's the conductor. He pulls the talent together so that he allows the company to sing the right song. They're all singing from the same prayer book. He must provide the leadership and be the bridge between the management and the board. I mean, the parties at the best of time are going to have times when they're at loggerheads with each other, or there is some dispute where management want to get a certain resolution passed and the board is reluctant to do so. The chairman is the one who has to orchestrate it, bring the parties together and get the decision, the correct decision or the right decision at the end of the day. He has to ensure that meetings are conducted in an environment of respect. And I keep bringing up the word respect because it is so critical to the proper operation of your board of directors. For the directors with each other, with management interacting with their board, and with the board interacting with management. What you want is to get, at the end of the day, the best decision for the organization. Chairman needs extraordinary listening skills. Every opinion matters. So he has to know from the skills matrix what the skills are of the directors he has around the tables, what they bring, what their strengths are. He has to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of the board so that he can pull up maybe the director that doesn't have a particular skill. In pulling together all of that, he will get the best decision from his board of directors. He has to ensure that they understand and give them the opportunity to ask questions. And sometimes you do that by actually going around the table and asking, Jackie, did you understand that issue? Is there anything you would like clarified? Now, with respect to, it is critical that the chairman have the agenda beforehand. If management wants the support of the chairman, they have to have taken the time to explain the issues before him and ensure that he is properly briefed, or else he cannot do his job. So the chairman must see the board papers beforehand, must have an agenda, and know what the decision is that he is expected to give. Next slide. We touched on this before. Board papers should be concise, as brief as possible, without jargon. I've sometimes had occasion where you pick up a board paper and if it's written in another language and you're asking every other word, what does that mean and what does that mean? It must be concise, without jargon, broken down so your directors can understand it, and the decision required must be very, very clear. I'm a big supporter of allowing directors to interface with your management so that they learn management's strengths and weaknesses. And this is very important when it comes to succession planning. So giving of presentations, allowing management to come before the board and make the presentation and explain their area, the topic which you want decision, allows the board to see management in action and their strengths, and to be able to challenge them face to face and ask questions. See the strength of your management. Some companies have the tradition where the board should meet without the CEO present. That is really up to the CEO and the chairman and the board, in fact, to decide if they want to follow that tradition. But maybe once a year, the board would meet without the presence of the CEO, so that the board can get a feel for management without the strength of the CEO. A chairman could also as well take the time to call his directors individually, speak to them, a phone call, get some feedback on his own performance, on the performance of the directors, what they would like to see on the agenda, or how they think the company is running and the board papers are running. The board is being conducted. Is there anything that they would like to see on the agenda? So he really has a chairman really has a very specific role, as I say, in pulling it all together so you get the optimal performance. Minutes as well. Again, we've said we don't like minutes that are verbose or too wordy. Influence the style, get it into a style that suits, that both the CEO and the board can agree that this is what we would like to see discussed and reflects the essence of what the board meeting was about. Okay, can we? This is just a plug for my brief minutes, insofar as is possible. This is a cartoon that I thought was relevant. There's last week, many of us had a tight schedule, so our meeting was rushed and very short. Ms. Jones, please read the seconds of our last meeting. So having seconds is probably taking it a bit too extreme, but concise minutes that give the essence of what was discussed and the tone of the decision, the tone of the meeting, and then the resolution. Okay? And it brings us to the end of my discussion. I'm just making a plug again for diversity, how important it is to have a board with a mixed variety of persons around your table, especially women, and the need for respect, that each of the players in this round the board table respect each other and treat each other with respect. Once this is done, you're going to have a meeting where you're able to give the directors a very rewarding and satisfying experience. Thank you. And I do want to apologize again for that drop in the internet. I hope I managed to catch back up to a certain extent what it is I intended to say. Thank you.
Yes, you did. You did very well. You know, thank you so much, Jacqueline.
It left me a little flustered, but I hope I managed.
Yes, yes. No, I think you absolutely did justice, you know, to sharing from your experience. Such diversity in terms of the different points that, you know, would help all of us who are listening here. So
Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to invite Brendan now. I know he also had prepared some slides for today. So are you sharing yourself, or do you want Joanna?
Joanna is.
Okay. All right. Do you want her to put on the slides now?
Sure.
With some opening remarks.
I can do both.
Okay, you need to choose.
You can go ahead and put the slides. There we go. Yeah.
Yes. All right.
Maybe just one slide back.
Yes.
There we go. One slide back. There we go.
Yes.
Right. So I'm really pleased to be here. I really want to thank Quamina and the whole CCGI team for the invitation. I recently joined the Institute. I've been fortunate enough to serve as senior management and then the director around the world. You know, I've been a director of the bank's subsidiaries in the Cayman Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Hong Kong, China, Singapore, and Thailand. So it's been a great experience worldwide and it's given me the opportunity to be exposed to a lot of different ways that boards operate, and taken a lot of lessons. And I started my board career in 1996, so dating myself a bit there, but and you know, really seen the evolution of corporate governance throughout the years, and really pleased to see it's moving in the direction it is, with increased transparency and an enhanced role for the board to help guide the business. You know, we all want good boards. You know, we want our companies to be successful, increase their output, increase their employment, help contribute to economic and social development. And a board plays a critical role in helping a company move forward and be successful for the long term. But good corporate governance can be tricky. And that's why I chose this picture, you know, the Jenga game, where you're very carefully pulling out the pieces and not have the whole thing fall over. So it can be tricky to get it right. And to support the company, we really need to have fully competent, experienced, suitably independent, and engaged boards to drive performance and support shareholder and stakeholder objectives. If we can flip the next slide. So a couple of topics here, and some of this will be repetition perhaps of what Jacqueline said, and I thought her presentation was right on, agreed with everything there. I want to focus a little bit on short-term versus long-term. We see that push and pull happening a lot. The board's role in strategy management, the board's role in performance management of both the company and the CEO, the critical role the board should play in succession and talent development, the role of communication between the management and the board and within the board and how important that is. And then to have a critical look at how do we assess the board and ensure it's performing well and take steps to renew the board. And a final thing that I think is important for our region is subsidiary boards in a multinational group. Obviously, I have a lot of experience in that, but we're seeing that take place much more. So those are the topics I'll cover and look forward to sharing some thoughts here. Next slide. First, that long-term versus short-term. And you see, I chose a picture, kind of a tug of war, because we see that happening a lot where, and it's a lot of what we had talked about with Jacqueline around, how the, the problems can come around too much focus on short term and not enough focus on long term. And long term is where I really think that we can add value as a board, to be really focusing on those bigger issues and not just the day-to-day management and what's going on. So long-term risk analysis is critical, and where a board really adds value. Really need to encourage the management team to think about competitive threats and opportunities that need to be broad-based, and not just who the competition is today, but who is it tomorrow. In the financial industry, we sometimes focus too much on the competitor down the street, or a public bank or a Royal Bank of Canada, where the big threats might be coming from fintechs and things happening online. So those are the things we need to be thinking about, and a board can help make sure that those kind of discussions take place. Need to think about the environment, the overall business environment, what government actions are taking places, what's happening with taxes and social issues, crime, how's that affecting our customer and our workforce, and of course the environmental impact of the business itself. For banks, that was a trend now away from financing what is viewed as non-desirable industries like arms manufacturing, but also perhaps oil and gas, which is really important industries in our region, especially in Guyana and in Trinidad. So how does a board deal with those issues and a company? And then every business should be thinking, of course, about digitization, big data, artificial intelligence, and cybercrime. How can that enhance or threaten the current business? Financial services, we've really seen a huge move to online and doing all your banking by phone. How does the bank manage that? How does the business manage that? Same thing in groceries, much more e-commerce now, much more delivery around, instead of people coming into the store. What impact does that have on the business long term? Those are the kind of things that really need to be brought out and discussed at the board. And of course, the disaster backup plans and organizational resiliency. Nothing could test that more than what we've seen in the past years. And we've seen certain businesses do very well and certain businesses not. At Scotiabank, management was responsible to prepare that disaster backup plan, have it tested annually, and have it approved by the board. So those are the kind of things that are really, really important. So if these aren't on your board agendas, really should be talking to your secretaries and your boards around getting them there. Next slide, please. Key is strategy. We talk about it a lot. Who owns a strategy? In my view, it's the management. I think like Jacqueline said, they do all the work. They hopefully with support of the board and the long-term view, it's the board's key accountability is to approve the strategy and monitor the strategic performance of the business. But management owns that strategy. While management owns it, the board needs to ensure that management has clearly identified the threats and opportunities and has designed a sound strategy that position the firm for long-term success. And that's what we all want, success for the long term, not the next quarter. This needs to be externally focused. Too often I've seen strategies that are based on internal reviews and incremental improvements to existing operations. That's not going to allow the company to meet all those external threats we talked about that are out there. And in my view, all this should be reviewed in a dedicated session, a couple hours long. We used to do 4-hour sessions at Scotia and Trinidad and Jamaica and the DR, to ensure there's sufficient time and focus that can be brought to bear. Good questions can be asked, and sometimes the strategy needs to be amended and changed. Approval of the final strategy needs to be accompanied by a clear set of metrics to monitor performance, with those to be presented at following board meetings to ensure that you stay on track and the strategy is working. Gaps to plans that are identified need to be addressed and have meaningful actions taken quickly, and not months and weeks down the road. So that's critical in the management of the strategy. Can we go to the next slide? Performance. There's a lot of components of performance, and I really want everybody to think about a lot of issues around performance. Performance management's clear, the fiduciary duty of the board to take that into account. But sustainable financial performance must be demonstrated to ensure the long-term survival of the business. I really recommend a limited number of key metrics be used to assess performance. Profitability, of course, but also revenue, expenses, what we call operating leverage, which is ensuring that the revenue percentage growth is faster than the expense percentage growth. You want to look at your return on equity and assets, but don't have too many, as this will only confuse matters and makes it hard to see if you're winning or losing. And speaking of that, market share is key. If you're beating your budget, but losing share to competitors, the firm is in for future problems. The board needs to be aware of that and ask for that market share number on a quarterly, annual basis for sure, to ensure that the business is winning in the marketplace. And it's not just financial metrics. Satisfied employees and customers are key to long-term success and should be monitored and managed just like financial returns. Benchmarking against your competitors is key, and many firms are using the Net Promoter Score to measure both. At Scotia, we did that on an ongoing basis, looking at the industry and looking at our own performance. And is our Net Promoter Score winning? I had an actual goal in my performance metrics around improving Net Promoter Score from customers and from employees. The only way you can have long-term success, in my view, is if your employee engagement is high. Your employees are motivated and working hard. So we need to have real action plans to be implemented and monitored to address the issues. Persistent failure to meet these goals has to be addressed by the board. And that takes us to our next slide. CEO performance management. Tricky, critical though. A key role of the board is to drive the organizational accountability. And we would review CEO performance management against the set of goals on a quarterly basis. In line with the overall monitoring of performance, it's really important to do this and have a key set of goals. The board needs to consider not only the results, but how they were achieved, the direct actions of management, or just a strong marketplace that lifted all boats. Best practice we found is to have the CEO's goals cascaded throughout the organization as much as possible. That ensures full alignment. At Scotia, we also held in-camera sessions without the CEO present to discuss the performance quarterly with an open review of the strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities for improvement. The board chair, often myself, would then have a frank review with the CEO and provide coaching where needed. We never wanted to have a surprise at year end when performance was formally measured and the compensation set. And should the performance not meet the standards and improvement was not seen after coaching, the board needs to consider the tough act of replacing the CEO. A real danger to the entire organization is a complacent board that's too tied to management and doesn't take the hard decisions before it's too late. And finally, compensation. Really important. What gets measured gets managed, and what gets managed gets paid. So compensation needs to be tied to meeting the performance metrics and the strategic deliverables. So compensation should go up and should go down depending on results. The salary is often set, and that's fine, but it's the variable parts of compensation. need to have real fluctuations depending on performance. And everybody needs to see that so that the entire organization feels accountable. Next slide. Perhaps the most important thing we can do on a board is handle succession and talent development. This needs to be supported by a rigorous process that evaluates talent, performance, and leadership potential. Succession plans for the CEO and at least the first line executives, hopefully throughout the organization, but at CEO and first line should be presented to the board and discussed. There should be a detailed review. And it's important we don't confuse good performance at the current level with an ability to take on greater leadership potential. As we know, often the best salesman is not the best sales manager. Detailed development plans should be developed and implementation steps reported to the board on a regular basis. And where there are succession gaps identified, and you can't fill them from within, outside active recruitment should take place. New talent from outside the business and even the industry can bring needed new perspectives and challenge the status quo. Part of our CEO at Scotia, part of his goals was to attract 10% of new executive talent from outside the bank. So we could promote at least 90% into new VP and SVP roles. But that last 10%, we would try to bring in from outside the bank to get that new perspective. Diversity goals are important and should form part of the CEO scorecard. But quotas are different than goals, because for the long-term health of the enterprise, the best candidate should get the job. But what does best mean? Best looks at all the talents and attributes that an individual brings, not necessarily the best at finance or the best at one thing or the other. And we have to ensure that our own internal biases and our unconscious biases are addressed and put on the table so that we know that we're making the right decision for the long-term benefit of the organization. Next slide. Board and management communication is key. We need healthy, transparent, two-way communication. That's key to fostering a strong relationship between board and management. And I think that's important. It doesn't, I don't think, impacts the ability of the board to hold management accountable, but you don't want to have an adversarial relationship. And the board chair plays a key role in setting the tone. So the tone is inquisitive, supportive, and collaborative, but when necessary, challenging to ensure the right decisions get made. You know, I always thought that the post-formal, the post-board meeting lunches and dinners that we held with senior management was very, very effective at building rapport and gaining additional insights on key threats and opportunities facing the business. So I'd always make sure I'd stay over an extra day in a country, make sure I had dinner that night with the senior management and the whole board to have those good informal discussions over a glass or two of wine. Amazing what you can learn. So I recommend you take that time. And I really think, it's really important for, between meetings that management and the board and the chair especially can have some calls. And I think Jackie mentioned this around, for issues outstanding or critical issues, you don't want the board to be informed on things from a newspaper or, a report on the television. That's not going to build the relationship that you want. You want to keep the board informed on key issues that are going to come up. I think boards should visit the facilities, factories, and stores that the company has, really help them gain a lot more knowledge of the business and understanding of the threats. Reading, is one thing, and seeing pictures is another. But getting out there, walking the factory floor, visiting the stores, talking to some customers, the store manager can be critical for the board to understand how really the business is doing. So because of this changing nature of the role of a board member, we're seeing a real trend away from the per diem or per meeting type of compensation. and much more on annual retainers. And this reflects the fact that the board job is not, once a quarter or a couple times a year or at a committee meeting. It's really a full-time role in the sense of you can be called on, and should be called on as and when needed. So that's why the compensation should change and is changing in global boards for sure. And Scotia's done this in the subsidiaries in the Caribbean as well to reflect the changing nature of the requirements from our board members. Next slide. Board performance and renewal is really the final piece of the puzzle to ensure that the board and the company continue to do its role and help the business going forward. The board chair plays a key role in setting a high standard for engagement and calling on all voices to be heard. We all know, and certain directors on certain boards tend to be dominant and crowd out others, and certain people don't really get a chance to speak if they're more laid back or introverted. So it's important that the chair balances the time so all voices can be heard. Remember, everybody's been put on the board for their skills and their experience and knowledge that they bring. So it's important that the board chair kind of balances the voices that are heard so everybody gets a chance. More and more boards are using formal surveys and interviews in an annual review process to complete a self-assessment and a diagnostic. It's important that this is conducted in a frank and open manner to make sure real issues are raised and addressed. And we found this to be a very useful exercise done every year, and created a lot of interesting issues around, the board papers are too thick, they're not presented in time, we don't spend enough time on strategy. A lot of good feedback came from those sessions and were then acted upon, which was critical, acted upon to improve the performance of the board. Renewal is important. Gaining new voices and new membership people to come on to the board, I think is very important. So you're seeing a lot of multinationals and others now instituting formal term limits, 10 years or 15 years. That can be, subject to ad hoc extensions should the circumstances warrant. This can eliminate the reluctance of boards to seek the renewal that they need and to bring on new members, which is really critical to gaining new perspective and alternative outlooks. It's very difficult to ask a board member to step down. You live in the same community, go to the same church, very awkward. Putting in place the term limits eliminates that issue and makes it transparent and clear to everyone. And in many of our markets, there's a perceived shortage of qualified directors. So the process of renewal should be ongoing. When people will be coming up, you need to take the steps early on and cast the net wide. Diversity is incredibly important. Gender is very important, but also ethnicity, background, and profession, so that there's a good balance of views on the board. I really look for business people to come on the board to bring that business perspective to, we often see a lot of boards with good lawyers and good accountants, and those are important. Academics are important, but also important to get on business people who run a business on a day-to-day basis and give you real impacts on what's happening. Next slide, and my final one. Subsidiary boards. It shows the picture of walking a tightrope here, because it can be a little bit like that. But this is an increasingly relevant topic in the region with the presence of subsidiaries and many multinationals like the banks and oil companies. And as local champions expand on a regional basis. We're seeing that a lot now, where you're seeing subsidiaries of Trinidad or Barbados or Jamaica, DR companies spreading out, setting up subsidiaries, putting boards in place. It's really important that these subsidiary boards function well. Getting the balance right is key. I have once experienced an issue in one of our subsidiaries where we own less than 100%, and the subsidiary shares were traded on an exchange, where the locally appointed directors started to view themselves just representing the interests of the local shareholder. So that's not what directors are for, of course. It's to maximize the opportunities of the company as a whole and the best interests of that business. So, that took some time to get that alignment back in place so that there's no we versus them taking place. And nor should the subsidiary board become a rubber stamp for the corporate parent. The subsidiary board has a fiduciary duty to optimize the interests of that company, so it has to perform its role. But there needs to be good alignment. Unlike in an independent company, the strategy of the wider enterprise has to factor in very much so in its subsidiaries. So there's alignment there. So local directors need to support the global strategy, but the global strategy should be influenced as well in each market by the peculiarities and the opportunities in that market, which may be different. So one size fits all implemented 100% down the line doesn't make sense either. So it's again that balance. So there needs to be ongoing efforts made at the parent company and the subsidiary level to ensure there's alignment. So good communication is really important to communicate those changes in global strategy and the reasoning behind the key decisions that affect the group. I always recommend bringing the local board to the headquarters to meet with executives. Visiting executives from the parents should be meeting with the board, explaining the strategy and bringing them up to date on what's happening at the global parent. And in that way, you can have a very strong functioning local board that's well aligned and has a proper voice to manage and supervise the business. So that's my thoughts on corporate governance, which I think is critically important to the success of businesses. I'm so pleased to be able to work with the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, which I think is doing tremendous work in the region, and I look to stay involved with them for many years forward. So Kamala, over to you.
Thank you very much, Brandon. They really appreciate that presentation too. We could definitely have seen the Scotiabank influence. The color of the slides helped. Yes, and yes, some certainly a different and very interesting perspective as well. So as we are moving close to the 3 o'clock hour, I want to go directly to Sandra because we'd like to have her make her contribution as well. And then we'd be able to allow, I know that there are some questions in already, and some persons are holding their questions in. So I want to make sure we have some time to allow you to engage as well. Sandra is therefore going to speak to us directly. So Christy, I'm going to ask if we can spotlight her and yes, let her address us directly with her thoughts on some of the issues she'd want to share. So Sandra, I'm handing over to you now.
Thanks very much, Kamala, and thank you for the invitation. Like the other speakers, I've seen this issue from all the angles: the chair, the director, the management, the advisor, the corporate secretary, and private sector, public sector, third sector, sport, and so I think that there's a lot that we can pull from these experiences. And my comments are going to be just to put things in the wider context in the first instance, just a few comments on that, and then to pull out some of the issues that I would want to focus on. And I must say that I really have absolutely no disagreement with anything that has been said by Jackie and Brendan. In a sense, it's almost as though we collaborated on these. And I think that once you work in this space, that you get a very good appreciation of what the issues are. But the first point that I would want to make is that we need to, first of all, place this in the wider context of where corporate governance is evolving and has evolved. And we see that there's much more emphasis on the stewardship role of the board in terms of driving long-term value creation and sustainability. And I think that we also see that there's an acknowledged linkage between business failures and the impact on the wider society. So things like job losses, loss of tax revenue, loss of essential goods and services, and overall economic growth can be severely impacted if there's a business failure. And this is what governance is really intended to protect us against. I mean, the COVID, is probably a classic example in terms of the point that I'm making. And the other, in that context, I think that we also need to appreciate that corporate governance principles have therefore, in terms of their scope and their applicability, have therefore expanded to not just the regulated entity or the listed entity, but you find that and increasingly any entity whose failure has whose business failure has an impact, is increasingly being drawn into the corporate governance net. So just moving on now to my specific points, and against that background, the first point that I would want to make is that this whole discussion that we are having really and truly is not in a vacuum. It really is against a background that to have effective board governance, you need a robust corporate governance structure in the first place. And so, I make that point, and I think that it is important. So, a couple of things that I'm going to pull out. And as I said, apart from having your governance structures and processes, which obviously I won't go into, I think that the point that I would make in that regard is that we need to make sure that those practices are practical, are fit for purpose, and are scaled to the organization that we're dealing with. There's no point in having an elaborate structure if it doesn't work for the organization. The other thing that I've found in my experience is that it is important to have a couple of corporate governance champions to do all the things that Jackie and Brendan have talked about. If your chair is not on board, if your CEO is not on board, and if your corporate secretary or chief governance professional, by whatever name called, is not on board, then none of these things that we're talking about are going to happen easily. The other thing that I think is important is the attention that needs to be paid to board selection. And previous speakers have talked about this. The need to make sure that the right competencies are on the board and the effective use of your competency matrix. Some people call it a skills matrix to inform director selection and to help you move away from the old boys network, from the nepotism and the cronyism that we knew in the past. And of course, we've already spoken about the diversity and the inclusion, and that is so necessary to make sure that that we get diverse perspectives. And the whole point is that it's not diversity for diversity's sake. It is diversity to make sure that we can get the best possible decision, because all the angles and the perspectives have been covered, so that when you reach a decision, the decision is a decision that is probably in the best interest of the company, taking into account all the stakeholders. And we move away, therefore, from the whole old boys network and the group thing. Then I'd just like to make a couple of points on board preparation, and Jackie would have spent quite a bit of time on this. So I'm just going to add to her comments, because obviously it's pointless for me to restate some of the points that she has made, which I fully agree with. And first of all, management of the agenda. And I think that that we've kind of implicitly talked about that. But one of the things that we need to make sure is that your board has a mandate, and your board is expected to engage on certain things and to deliberate and approve certain things in the course of a year. And if you have an agenda schedule, it helps you to make sure that when you build your agenda through your quarters or whatever the period is for your board meetings, that you cover all the things that you need to cover, and also any ad hoc matters that may come up from time to time. So the tool of a board agenda schedule, I think, tends to help. And then I think that Jackie spoke about the board book and how you organize your board papers, and I'm not going to go into that. 110% agree. What are you being asked to do? Are you being asked to approve? Are you being asked to note? Are you being asked to discuss the summary of the salient issues? And she's covered that so well. So fundamentally, I mean, I have been on boards where 1,200 pages have been thrown at me. 1,200 pages, 1,000 pages, 500 pages have been thrown, I literally say thrown at the directors. And the point is that some directors like to read and some directors don't like to read. But the obligation of anybody who is involved in this exercise of building a board book has to be that you need to engage all the directors to make sure that an informed decision is made. So Jackie's points about how you structure your board papers and the use of the presentation to drive home the points, you know, I can't reinforce enough. And of course, the whole question of the preparation in advance and so on. We've already covered the minutes, and I would have made the point about, you know, about the importance of making sure that you can demonstrate due diligence in arriving at the decision. And also my recommendation that after a certain time that the notes and so on be destroyed. Now, in the boardroom itself, one of the things that I have found that has been particularly troublesome is the management of conflicts of interest. And we've talked about that before. And some conflicts are easy to spot. You know, I have a business which is competing with or which supplies the company of which I'm a director. That's pretty easy to spot. But there's some that are more difficult to recognize. And in my experience, I've found that in a lot of cases, directors do not even recognize that there's a conflict. Now, one of the examples that Brendan gave, I think, is particularly instructive, and it's the whole question of subsidiary governance and the tension, the natural tension between the obligation of the subsidiary director to discharge his fiduciary duty, while at the same time taking into account the larger group strategy. This is particularly compounded where the subsidiary is regulated or is a listed entity, and the regulator starts to intervene and starts to try to make sure that that separation is very clear and distinct. And as I said, you know, I wouldn't say any, make any further comments other than to say that I fully endorse Brendan's comment about the necessity to have that alignment between the two and to find that balance. But the important point to pull out, which, as I said, you know, I've always found to be an issue that we need to be very aware of, is the potential breach of the director's fiduciary duty if you do find yourself in these conflict situations, and the need, if you, for example, are a corporate secretary, to help the chair manage the conflicts. Most organizations will have annual declarations of interest, which the corporate secretary has access to. And in some cases, it may be necessary to, even if the director doesn't disclose the conflict, to remind the chair that there may be a conflict, or in some cases where, for example, I didn't think that the conflict merited action or positive management, I've taken the liberty of making sure that the minute recorded that the person had an interest, and so that for the record, it was absolutely clear that we had looked at that. And then, of course, I think performance evaluation, I think is a tool that we really do need to be able to perfect the use of, and to recognize that it's not about penalizing anyone, but it's about ferreting out areas of weakness, which can form the basis of maybe ongoing director education to improve board effectiveness. And the other point that I would make from my experience is that how that is managed is something that has to be, I think, examined in the context of each company, for the simple reason that the internal management of performance evaluation can only succeed if there's trust, tremendous trust and confidentiality by the board members of the person who's conducting it. If that trust and confidentiality is in any way in question, then you know, the process needs to be outsourced to an external party. And then, of course, we would have talked about the importance of the director education and making sure that the directors understand the business, the risks, the issues, and so on. So, you know, my contribution is really to say that I fully endorse what has been said in the two formal presentations, and just to look at some of the areas that I think are particularly important or troublesome to deal with, and to say that you know, that governance really has to be looked at in the context of a very real and dynamic management of a situation to make sure that directors are fully engaged and that the company does achieve its long-term goals and objectives. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. Hope I haven't been too long, and we can probably go into some questions now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sandra. I truly appreciate that, the additional points that you have made. And I particularly enjoyed where you have ended. So, you know, sometime we're probably going to have a session on that specifically, and that is the whole area of the director education and directors understanding governance practices as well. Just earlier today, in fact, I had a conversation with a former director who pointed out that the reality is many times directors resist the additional training and education because they already think that they know. And then that leads to very difficult decisions sometimes.
Yeah, if I could just make a comment, I have actually been on boards of two companies where there's the complete extreme. In one case, fully embracing corporate governance practices, and then in the other case, they don't even want to hear the word. Both publicly listed companies, they don't even want to hear the word. And the struggle that, because you can't back off, the struggle to sensitize directors to the importance and the value of corporate governance practices and so on. So it really is a journey. You know, it's not something that you just switch on the light for.
Yes, thank you. And if I may just add from CCGI's point of view, one of the things that you mentioned too was who drives that corporate governance discussion if you don't have persons on the board, you know. So we are trying to find those people to make sure that boards understand and are engaged. So I know we have several comments and questions on the chat, so I don't want to take up some of the time. So we'll start with the last one first, if persons don't mind. We have from Michelle Loban Clark. She says, with reference to having a robust corporate governance structure, can Sandra, so Sandra, she's asking you, or any of the speakers, advise what would be or what should be the top corporate governance priorities for a newly established board?
I think I've kind of alluded to that in my opening remarks by saying that you need to have a framework. I think that, you know, corporate governance is not an ad hoc, just we pull from here and we pull from there. I think you need to have a framework that's robust, that meets best practice, that's fit for purpose, and is scaled to your organization. And there's certain things. I mean, anybody who's a corporate governance practitioner who's been involved in this thing knows the areas that we need to hit in terms of the structures and the processes and some of the softer stuff, you know, the boardroom dynamics and the chair's role and stuff like that. Some of the things that have been discussed. So I think that it's a very structured process that I think that one needs to take in terms of first of all, acceptance that this has to happen. Secondly, the champions need to be there in the right place, in the right places. And then thirdly, the work needs to be done to create the architecture.
Okay, very good, thank you.
I can add.
Yeah, Jackie, go ahead, Brendan.
Sorry, Jackie. Or...
Go on, Brendan. Go on.
Okay. Just, you know, it's tough to set up a new board, but maybe two key hires would be the corporate secretary, getting an experienced corporate secretary from a strong board, committed to good, transparent corporate governance to really help set in place your frameworks, your processes. You know, obviously call on someone like Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute to provide guidance. Always a good idea, I'm sure. And then who are you going to name as board chair? You know, that board chair, first board chair appointment is critical, I think, because, you know, someone who is committed to transparency, committed to good corporate governance, can be involved in the recruitment of other directors, I think would put your board on a good framework to go forward. With that, pass it over to you, Jackie.
Yes, yes. I would zero in on, of course, it's a framework, but one of the most critical areas there is the delegation of authorities. So who is doing what and who is responsible for what? Where does the reporting lie? And that can be a little tricky to do, a little time consuming to work out. But how much authority does your CEO have? What has to go to board? What can he decide? Those sort of decisions can be very tricky and time consuming.
Okay. All right, great. And Ulrich Miller has asked another question. And it's one that I really want to talk about as well, but he has zeroed in on a particular area. So he asked, can any of the speakers talk to the management of board dynamics when there's a dominant chair? So Jackie, you're on the floor. You want to go first?
Right. Well, I spoke of a question of respect all the time, how important it is to have respect in the boardroom. I mean, a dominant chairman, maybe dominant is the wrong word, can be a good thing in that he is going to manage his board. But if it is to the extent that other directors are stifled and not allowed to give their perspective, it can be damaging to get the best decision from the board. So I think in that situation, I would call on your senior independent director. Hopefully you have a senior independent director who could maybe whisper to the chairman, you know, maybe you need to back down a bit, or maybe you would like to seek the opinion of some other directors in the meeting to encourage him to maybe back off a bit. Mm-hmm. That would be my quick answer to that one.
I would agree. I think you would need to have the directors, you know, another, you know, a senior director, you know, well-respected person, someone who can speak to the chairman. It could be the corporate secretary. It could be the CEO, depending on the dynamics, you know, who could say that, you know, the board would benefit from more voices and the ability to hear more opinions. That could also come out, if necessary, in your evaluation process, which I felt was so important on an annual basis, where you would get good, honest feedback from the directors. And that was often managed by your, you know, equivalent of your HR committee or your nomination committee to bring those things out.
Yeah, I'd like to add, I agree with what has been said. I've actually had situations where you've seen dominant CEOs, or you've seen overly docile directors. So there are a lot of different scenarios that can play out. And in addition to the recommendations that have been placed on the table, one of the things that I have found to be very useful is not necessarily to deal with some of these things head on. And of course, sometimes it's required, you know, that you deal with it head on, but to find a way of maybe engaging the board in terms of education and looking at boardroom dynamics and boardroom behavior, and, you know, optimum leadership styles and interpersonal styles. I've actually had to do that. Have a session on boardroom dynamics as a part of director education, because some of the relationships weren't necessarily healthy. And it was interesting, you know, you brought in somebody obviously who was external to the organization. But the point is that I think that in a lot of cases, people sometimes don't even realize that their behavior is not acceptable. And in fact, I'm dealing with a situation like that now in another context, where the chairman basically, you know, if the discussion is going in a direction that he doesn't like, he brings the meeting to a close. He shuts down the meeting, regardless of whether the agenda has been dispatched or not. I mean, and you know, the only thing that I can say is we need to communicate to this individual that this behavior is not acceptable. So I think that depending on the situation, you know, you either handle it in a very discreet way or a very diplomatic way, or you handle it in a bit more, you know, direct way. But I really, you know, one of the things that I have found is that it is incredibly important for people to appreciate what their role is, to appreciate what is the role of a chairman, what is the role of a director, not just in terms of behavior. So it's not just in terms of the competencies that you bring, but what are the personal attributes that you need to bring to the board table in order to be an effective board member. And, you know, Jackie would have mentioned a lot of those attributes in terms of the respect but at the same time, you've got to challenge management. You've got to make sure that the discussion is diverse and wide. And if people understand their roles, then hopefully they're able to, at some point, remember some of these, constraints.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much, Sandra. We do have a question also from, I think it's Karen. Before I go to that, though, I want to ask Christy to put on the chat the evaluation for today's session. And I want to encourage all of our participants, please, can you fill it out? It's just going to take you a few minutes, but it's very useful for us to have this feedback, okay? Also, we'll be sending out surveys for our members to tell us from the membership point of view as well. So we know that we are responding to your needs. So to go to the question from Minad now, Karen asked, is it permissible for the corporate secretary to reach out to the board members? He said there may be suggestions of fixes that are noticeable in the meeting, but that may not be the best place to raise them. So is the corporate secretary permitted to reach out to the board in that way, or must it be through the CEO?
If it were me, I would have a discussion with the chair. I would let the chair do that. I think that kind of discussion is between the chair and the director, unless the corporate secretary was asked specifically. But one of the things about performance evaluation is that it affords the opportunity for a one-on-one discussion between the chair and the director. And maybe in that context, or if there's a specific need, that you have that discussion. That would be my preference.
Okay. So let me ask Karen if that would have covered his question specifically, or was there something else that he would have had in mind? Karen, otherwise I'll ask Jackie to give her take as well.
Hi, good day.
Right.
All right, quick if I speak instead of type.
Yes.
Well, I'm thinking in the context of things that I would have observed at the time a new CorpSec, things that could come in to help facilitate the meetings, help the meetings flow a little faster, a little better. But again, I don't want to be out of place. And you're the new guy, and you want to come and like you could fix everything. So it doesn't matter. And then there's also, I think from one of the previous sessions that we had, there was some lack of clarity on my part whether the CorpSec more aligns himself with the chairman or with the CEO in the company. So, well, who could you make a simple in quotes suggestion to get something done better, or to help the company without mashing a two?
Okay, good. Yes, thank you, Karen. Jacqueline, you want to add?
Yes. Well, if I start with the last point first, the corporate secretary really walks a tightrope. You have to balance your loyalty to the company and your CEO together with your chairman. I mean, it's a slippery rope. But if you had to take a side, I suppose you would say is the chairman. But a skillful corporate secretary is going to walk that tightrope and balance both right the way through. With respect to, I think I'm not quite sure I got the question. If it's a director has issues that they would like to raise, probably the best person to go to is through the chairman. But it really depends on the particular dynamics of your board. I think going to the chair and mentioning it to the chair is the proper way to go. But if you have a sort of proactive corporate secretary or whatever, you could mention it to the corporate secretary and see what happens.
So from the corporate secretary's point of view, I think working with the chair helps setting the tone and the agenda. And therefore, that would help if you think that being able to manage the flow of the meeting or so may be different. I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, as I said before, I was fortunate to have a really excellent CorpSec at the board in Trinidad, and she was wonderful to, she would come to me with ideas and thoughts, and always handled it very, very well. So, I think the dynamic was really good. I was obviously open to it, and that's important. And sometimes if there were smaller matters, she would talk to the CEO, who would talk to me, as we would talk on a number of issues. So can handle either way, but can certainly go from the secretary to the chairman.
What I would like to add, Kamla, is that I think that it is important for the corporate secretary to have an exceedingly good relationship with both the chair and the CEO. I don't think that it works if there are tensions in that relationship. And I think there needs to be mutual respect as well. I mean, I have heard some younger corporate secretaries say that they've had trouble having their voices heard. And I can understand that. But the point is that I think that where we need to work towards, where there's a situation of mutual respect, and you can then walk that tightrope that Jackie talked about more effectively.
Very good. I really appreciate, this wide range of experience that we have had here today. But I am conscious I don't want us to go past the 3:30, but I do have a question. I see Kevin Patmore has raised his hand. So I'm going to give him a minute, Kevin, to ask your question before we come to our team of speakers to have them do their closing remarks. So you can, yes, go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon all, and great presentations from everyone. I mean, it was very informative. I just want to touch on something that Jackie mentioned, and she spoke about the quality of the board papers coming from management and whether it included certain key things like the background, the issues, the risk, and those things that really ought to be in a board paper. And one of the things that I thought is very useful and so on from the perspective of management is actually having a template that could be used. And the template will indicate exactly what is required in the board paper. So the background, those same areas should be mentioned, and a description of what is expected to be included in each section. And then, of course, finally, it should also indicate what is required of the board, which is very, very key. Whether the board is required to make a decision, to note something, to approve something, what is required. And I don't know what your thoughts on that aspect of it is.
Okay, thank you so much for your question, Kevin. And I just want to ask again, please, can everyone fill out the survey for us? It's just going to take 2 minutes of your time. And yes, we are back with you, Jackie. Now it's 27. So I will ask you as you respond to Kevin, if you could also give us your closing remarks.
All right. I think Kevin touched on a very important point. I think you can have a framework that sort of provides the guidelines for your board paper. You can't have a board paper without allowing the board, letting them know what it is they're there for. So they have to that resolution is critical. Must have the resolution there, whether it's to note or approve or whatever. Closing remarks. I'm going to close on my closing marks of my paper: diversity, 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 and respect, respect, respect.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you.
Yes, Brandon.
I'd just like to thank everybody again for the time and the ability to have this conversation. I love the commitment that the region is showing to good corporate governance. And this is critical, I think, to the future of the private sector, which is critical to development of our country. So really appreciate the work that the Institute is doing. Glad to assist in any way I can, and looking forward to many more sessions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So Sandra?
Thank you. I will leave with you that corporate governance needs to be alive. It needs to be dynamic, and it needs to be relevant. And the champions that I talk about need to be sensitive to any pushback that will require us to maybe look at how we do things. But the important thing is not to see corporate governance as a manual that you put on the shelf and you tick the boxes for. I think it has to be something that you live and you breathe, and the culture and the principles are infused in everything that we do and we think, and we think about. So you know, we really do need to live it.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandra. Thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Jacqueline. And I want to thank all of our participants who have been with us for the last 2 hours as well. Let me just remind everyone, just on the note that Sandra has ended with, corporate governance is so important. It is an area that we need to address all the while. We need to grow and live it. And therefore, from CCGI perspective, we are very happy to be able to really help push that conversation. So I'm going to ask you, look out for all the many things that we have coming, and especially what I had forgotten to mention in my opening remarks, which is our governance week, you know, which is really going to be our signature event. It's a week of discussion focusing on each of these sectors. It's going to be at the end of June. We had launched Governance Week last year in the midst of the whole pandemic, and we've been able to bring together 42 professionals from the region, 42 who were able to share in so many different ways and you know, their experiences. And so we are looking forward again this year to being able to have Governance Week at the end of June. And we invite all of you to really continue to be present with us, to join us, and let us all together help build the region. All right, so thank you all very much. And don't forget, please fill out the survey. Right, thank you all. Have a good evening now. Bye.